Willis Rand grabbed Clara Whitmore by the wrist and wrenched her off the porch steps so hard her boots left the ground. She didn't scream. That was the thing nobody expected. She just went rigid, jaw locked, eyes burning straight into the man's face, while he dangled her arm like she weighed nothing, like she was a piece of property he was already bored with. "Your daddy's dead," Rand said, quiet as a confession. "That changes the math." Behind him, 6 riders sat their horses in a loose arc across the yard, and not one of them looked away. That spring, the hidden water source deep in the Red Rock country of New Mexico territory had already cost 1 life. Now a hired gun was deciding whether it would cost another. If a story like this deserves to be heard, hit that like button and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this one travels. Subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Some stories only get told once. The summer of 1883 came to Haskell County like a punishment. It hadn't rained in 6 weeks. The creosote brush had gone gray and brittle along the ridgelines, and the dry creek beds were cracked open like old wounds that refused to heal. Cattle were dying on 3 ranches to the north, and 2 homesteaders south of Redemption Flats had already packed their wagons and left without saying goodbye to anyone, because there was no one left to say goodbye to. Water was everything that summer. Water was money, and money was survival, and survival in that country was never a guarantee. It was an argument you had to make every single day with the land and the heat and the men who wanted what you had. Clara Whitmore had made that argument every day since the morning she found her father slumped over the kitchen table with one hand wrapped around a cold coffee cup, and his heart stopped somewhere in the night. Thomas Whitmore had been 53 years old and had never been sick a day that Clara could remember. And then one morning he simply wasn't alive anymore. And the ranch, the Rocking W, 340 acres of hard-won New Mexico ground, fell entirely to her. She was 28 years old. She had no brothers. Her mother had died of fever when Clara was 11. She had Domingo, the old Mexican hand who had worked the ranch since before she was born, and she had Petey, a 14-year-old boy from town who mucked stalls for $2 a week and ate whatever was left over at supper. That was her crew. That was her army. And she had the spring. Most people in the valley didn't know exactly where it was. Her father had kept that information close, the way a man keeps the combination to a safe in his chest rather than written down somewhere. But Garrett Pruitt knew. Garrett Pruitt made it his business to know everything worth knowing in Haskell County, and the Whitmore Spring, reliable, cold, fed by some underground river that didn't care what the weather did on the surface, was worth more than everything else on that ranch combined. Pruitt had sent a man out 6 weeks ago, a polite man in a clean coat who sat at Clara's kitchen table and drank her coffee and made an offer in a pleasant voice, the way you'd discuss the weather. $1,200 for the land and the water rights. Full deed transfer. She'd have enough to start over somewhere, he said, somewhere easier, somewhere more suited to a woman on her own. Clara had shown him the door. Then Pruitt sent Willis Rand. Rand wasn't a man who sat at kitchen tables. He wasn't a man who drank coffee or spoke in pleasant voices. He was a working tool, lean, cold-eyed, with a face like a heel of old leather, and hands that had done the kind of work that left marks you didn't talk about in polite company. He had ridden for Pruitt for 4 years, and in those 4 years, 2 homesteaders had signed over their land at prices so low it was barely legal. One small rancher had suffered a barn fire of mysterious origin, and a Mexican sheep herder named Ortega had simply disappeared one winter and never been spoken of again. Rand had arrived at the Rocking W that morning with 6 men at his back. Clara had been standing on the porch when they came up the road. She'd seen the dust from a long way off and had stood there watching it come, and by the time the riders cleared the gate, she had already made up her mind about how this was going to go. She wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to cry. She was going to stand on the porch of her father's house, and she was going to make them look her in the eye. Rand had barely pulled up before he was off his horse and moving toward her with that loose, unhurried walk that men like him learned early. The walk that said he had never once in his life needed to hurry because things always went the way he wanted them to go. "Miss Whitmore," he said, touching the brim of his hat with 2 fingers in a gesture that wasn't really a greeting at all. "Mr. Rand." She kept her hands visible and her voice even. "You can turn around." He'd stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her with those flat eyes that gave away nothing. Mr. Pruitt's made a fair offer. Mr. Pruitt's made an insulting offer. There's a difference. One of the riders behind him made a sound, not quite a laugh. Rand didn't turn around. He just kept watching her. The water situation being what it is, he said, a reliable spring's worth considerably more than your father paid for this place. Mr. Pruitt's accounting for that. My father's dead 3 weeks, Clara said. I don't know what kind of man makes a water grab on a woman who's still grieving, but I know I don't want his money. Something shifted in Rand's face then. Not much, just a slight tightening around the jaw that told her the pleasantries were over. I'm going to need you to come down off that porch. You're going to need to leave my property. He moved fast. She'd known he was fast. You didn't work for Garrett Pruitt for 4 years without being fast. But knowing it and seeing it were different things. He came up the 2 steps in one motion and had her wrist before she could step back. And that was when she felt the real weight of what she was dealing with. His hand was like iron, and he twisted just enough to make the point without breaking anything. Not yet. Your daddy ain't here to negotiate for you, he said, very close to her face. And your daddy, God rest him, knew when a conversation was done. Clara didn't pull away. She'd found, in a bad moment years ago, when a horse had thrown her, and she'd lain in the dirt with a sprained wrist and blood in her mouth, that the worst thing you could do in a bad situation was panic. Panic burned energy you needed for thinking. She held still, met Rand's eyes, and said very clearly, "Let go of my arm. Sign the paper first. There is no paper that will change what this spring is worth, and you know that." Rand's grip tightened. She felt the bones in her wrist compress, and her vision went briefly white at the edges, and she thought, very clearly and without drama, "This is going to get bad. This is going to get very bad." And then a voice came from the road. "Leave her alone." 3 words, spoken without heat, without urgency, the way you'd tell a dog to get off the furniture. But something in the delivery, some quality of absolute stillness behind it, made every head turn. The man sitting the red roan horse at the edge of the yard looked like something the country had half digested and spat back out. He was trail-worn in the particular way of men who had been on the road long enough that the road had started to leave its marks on them permanently. Dust on his coat, dust on his hat, dust on the horse. He'd come up the south road, which meant he'd come through the worst of the dry flats, and the roan looked like it had earned a rest. He sat easy in the saddle, one hand loose on the pommel, watching Rand with an expression that contained no obvious emotion whatsoever. Rand turned his head slowly, taking in the stranger, making the kind of calculation men like him made automatically. Size, posture, the set of the shoulders, the way the hand lay near but not on the gun. "This ain't your business, friend." "Made it mine," the man said. He didn't move to dismount. He just sat there, and there was something about the way he sat there, the complete absence of fidgeting, of readiness, of anything that looked like nerves, that was more unsettling than if he'd drawn on them. 6 armed men, and he sat his horse like he was watching the sunset. One of the riders in the arc edged his horse sideways, cutting angle. The man on the roan tracked the movement with his eyes and nothing else. "Mister," Rand said, releasing Clara's wrist and stepping back down off the porch, "you're making a bad decision." "I've made worse," the stranger said. "Mostly I could live with them." The word mostly hung in the air for a moment. Rand studied him. Clara, pressing her wrist against her thigh to get the blood moving again, watched Rand study him, and she saw the calculation happening behind those flat eyes. 6 men against 1 drifter on a tired horse. The numbers said this was nothing. But something in the stranger's stillness was introducing doubt, and doubt was a seed, and Rand had lived long enough to know what that particular seed grew into. "You got a name?" Rand asked. "Most people do." "I'm asking yours." A pause. Then, "Devereaux." It didn't mean anything to Clara, but she saw 2 of the riders in the back exchange a look, the quick, involuntary kind that happens when something lands somewhere that wasn't expected. Rand's jaw shifted. "You're a long way from your territory." "Man wanders." "Man wanders into other men's business," Rand said. "Man ends up buried in it." Devereaux said nothing. He let the silence sit there like a third party, and it was Rand who finally had to break it. "We'll be back," he said, turning back to Clara. "You think on Mr. Pruitt's offer. Think hard on it." He walked back to his horse, mounted in one smooth motion, and the riders began to pull away. The last one out kept his eyes on Devereaux the whole time, walking his horse backward until there was enough distance that turning didn't feel like exposure. Clara stood on the porch until the dust had settled, until the sound of hooves had faded to nothing, until she was sure they were gone. Then she sat down on the top step because her legs had stopped cooperating, and she put her elbows on her knees and breathed. After a moment, she heard the creak of saddle leather and looked up. The man, Devereaux, had dismounted and was walking his horse toward the water trough by the barn, leading it by the reins with a slow, deliberate pace that made it clear he wasn't rushing anywhere. "You looking for water?" Clara asked. "I am," he said, without looking at her. "That all?" He stopped at the trough and let the roan drink. He took off his hat and ran a hand through the hair that was more gray than she'd expected at his age, which she put at somewhere between 40 and 45, though the road made it hard to say. He had a lean face with deep-set eyes and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in at least a week. "Water," he said, "and maybe somewhere to camp tonight if you've got ground to spare. I'll pay." "With what?" He reached into his coat and came out with $2 silver. He held them out without walking toward her, which she appreciated. "That's more than one night's camping is worth," she said. "Keep the difference." Clara looked at him for a long moment. A sane woman would send him on his way. A sane woman with 6 armed men threatening to come back in the morning would not invite a stranger to camp on her property because strangers were unpredictable, and unpredictable things were dangerous, and she had enough dangerous things in her life already. "There's a spot by the cottonwoods," she said, "out of the wind." He nodded, and that was the entirety of the negotiation. Domingo appeared from the barn as if he'd materialized out of the shadows, which was more or less how Domingo operated. He was 61 years old, thin as a fence rail, and had a habit of watching everything without appearing to watch anything. He looked at Devereaux, then at Clara, then back at the stranger. "Quién es?" he asked quietly. "Traveler," Clara said. "Passing through." Domingo said nothing. He just kept watching Devereaux with the particular attention of a man who had learned to read people the hard way. Supper was beans and salt pork and cornbread, and Clara brought a plate out to the cottonwoods because she wasn't ready to trust the man enough to invite him to her table, which she recognized was slightly absurd given that he'd just faced down 6 gunmen on her behalf. But trust was not something she was prepared to distribute quickly in the current circumstances. She found him sitting against a cottonwood trunk with his saddle beside him and the roan picketed nearby, and he had a fire going, small, practical, the kind that gave heat without advertising itself against the night sky. The kind a man built when he'd learned that fire was information. She set the plate down on the flat rock beside him and straightened up. "I don't know if I should be asking you to leave," she said. He picked up the plate. "Probably should." "You're going to tell me why you shouldn't?" He ate a spoonful of beans first. She had the sense this wasn't avoidance. He was just a man who didn't talk before he was ready to talk. "I rode in from Mesquite Station," he said finally. "Heard about your situation there. 2 men at the feed store talking about the Whitmore Spring and Pruitt moving on it. And that was your business because—" "It wasn't," he said simply. "I rode in for water and kept going when I saw what was happening." Clara sat down on a rock across the fire from him. "You didn't keep going." "No." He didn't elaborate on that. "You knew Willis Rand," she said. It wasn't a question. He took a moment. "Knew of him? But he knew your name." "Some men know my name," he said. "That's not always a good thing." She studied his face across the fire. He was eating steadily, without conversation, the way a man ate when he hadn't had a real meal in a couple of days. "What did you do?" she asked. "Before you were a man wandering into other people's business?" The fire popped. Out in the dark, a nighthawk called. "Law," he said. "Federal." "Federal marshal?" "Deputy. For 11 years. "What happened?" He set the empty plate on the rock and leaned back against the cottonwood. For a moment, she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I made a mistake. Cost people." He paused. 3 people. Innocent ones. "What kind of mistake?" "The kind you don't come back from," he said. Not with self-pity, just with the flat accuracy of a man who had reached a conclusion about himself a long time ago and had stopped arguing with it. Clara sat with that for a while. The fire settled. "I have a problem," she said. "I noticed. Rand will be back in the morning, maybe with more men. Likely. And the sheriff in town, Dale Huck. He's in Pruitt's pocket. Has been for years. My father used to say Huck couldn't find his own hat without Pruitt pointing at it." Devereaux almost smiled at that. Almost. "You have any allies in town?" She thought about it honestly, which meant she had to think about who she'd ruled out and why. "The banker Croft is scared of Pruitt, but he's not corrupt. Pastor Enlow—" She stopped. He'd said no religion. She adjusted. "The schoolteacher, Emmeline Voss, she's not afraid of anything, but she's one woman." "Doc?" "Doc Hearn. He was my father's friend." She felt the familiar pressure behind her eyes when she thought about that. "He might stand up if pushed, but he's old." Devereaux nodded slowly. "What about the spring itself? Access? Location?" "Northwest corner of the property, natural limestone formation. Water comes up through a fissure in the rock. My father diverted it into a collection basin about 20 years ago. There's a channel that runs down to the main trough." She paused. "It's not marked on any county map I've ever seen. My father was careful about that." "Pruitt knows where it is." "Pruitt knows. And Rand. I assume they've scouted it." Devereaux was quiet for a while, staring at the fire. Clara had the sense that he was thinking in a very organized way. Not turning the problem over emotionally, but looking at its architecture. She'd met few men who thought that way. Her father had been one. "You said your father kept evidence," Devereaux said. "At the feed store they mentioned a ledger." Clara went still. How would men at a feed store know about a ledger? He looked at her. That's the right question. The fire between them suddenly felt like insufficient protection against the dark. "Someone's been in this house," she said. Not with panic, with anger, which was cleaner. "Someone's been looking. Did they find it?" "I don't know," she said. "I didn't know anyone was looking." Devereaux stood up. He moved the way he did everything. Without urgency, but with complete intention. "Where do you keep it?" "In the house." "Then we need to know if it's still there." The house was dark when they went back to it, Domingo materializing from somewhere near the barn and falling into step without being asked. Petey was asleep in the bunkhouse. Clara had sent him there because he was 14 and she had enough to worry about. The ledger was her father's. She'd found it 3 days after his death, tucked behind a false back panel in the bottom drawer of his desk. A thing she'd only known about because she'd caught him putting it back once when she was 12 and had been curious enough to ask. He'd said it was important papers and she'd forgotten about it until grief had driven her back to that desk, looking for comfort in familiar objects. It was a standard accounting ledger, the kind any ranch would have, black oilcloth cover, dates running back 7 years. But the numbers in it weren't cattle prices or hay costs. They were payments, specific amounts, specific dates, names written in her father's careful hand. Pruitt's name, Huck's name. 2 county commissioners, a land surveyor named Calls who she'd never heard of, and next to several entries, initials that corresponded to properties that had changed hands in Haskell County under circumstances that had struck people as strange at the time. Clara had understood what she was looking at immediately. She'd put it back behind the false panel and had been trying to decide what to do with it ever since. The drawer was undisturbed when she opened it. She felt for the false panel, still solid, still seated. She pulled it open. The ledger was there. She exhaled. "It's here," she said. Devereaux was looking at the drawer with the expression of a man doing geometry in his head. "Your father kept the evidence of Pruitt's corruption in a ledger," he said, "and Pruitt doesn't know where it is, but he knows it exists. That's why he sent Rand." "That's part of why he sent Rand," Devereaux said. "The water is worth what it's worth, but a ledger full of evidence is worth considerably more. To Pruitt, it's the difference between a business inconvenience and a federal indictment." The word federal sat in the air between them. "You have contacts," Clara said slowly. "From before." He said nothing. "You left the marshal's service, but you didn't leave the territory." He picked up the ledger and opened it carefully, tilting it toward the lamp she'd lit. She watched his eyes move down the entries with the focused attention of a man who knew what he was reading. After a long moment, he closed it. "I know a man," he said, "in Santa Fe. He's not in the service anymore either, but he still has ears in the right places. Would he help?" "He owes me something," Devereaux said. "Whether that's enough, I can't say." Clara took the ledger back and held it. It was heavier than its pages warranted, weighted by everything it contained, everything her father had spent years quietly documenting, while living under the shadow of a man powerful enough to make problems disappear. Thomas Whitmore had been a careful man, a patient man. He'd built a record because he believed, apparently to the end, that records mattered. That truth, properly documented, eventually arrived somewhere useful. "What do we do with it tonight?" she asked. "Not leave it here," Devereaux said. They wrapped it in oilskin, and Domingo, without being asked, took it out to the barn and put it somewhere in the hay that he didn't tell either of them about. Clara thought that was probably wise. She was in the kitchen making coffee, because sleep felt like a luxury she couldn't afford, when Devereaux came back inside and sat down at the table across from her. Domingo stood in the doorway watching the road. "Tell me about Pruitt," Devereaux said. So she did. She told him about the land acquisitions, the ones her father had noted in the ledger, and the ones that were common knowledge. 6 smaller ranches bought up over the past 8 years, always after the owner hit some kind of trouble, always at prices below what the land was worth. She told him about the creek diversion on the Halbert property that had killed the Halbert cattle 2 summers ago, and about how the Halbert family had sold out 3 months later. She told him about the survey dispute on the Lena property that had ended in a courthouse proceeding nobody in town quite understood, with a surveyor named Calls who had subsequently moved to Arizona. She told him about her father's friendship with Doc Hearn and how her father had told Doc, about a year before he died, that he was building something. That was all he'd said. Building something. Doc had told her that at the funeral, with a particular look that said he'd been turning it over ever since. Devereaux listened without interrupting. He drank his coffee. He asked 2 questions. Who was Calls and what became of the Lena proceeding? And both questions went to the structural skeleton of Pruitt's operation rather than its surface. "He's been doing this for a decade," Devereaux said when she'd finished. "At least. And the ledger covers 7 years. The entries start in 76. He was quiet for a moment. "Your father documented more than water rights." "He documented everything he could find," Clara said. "I think he was waiting for someone to bring it to." The coffee was hot, and the night outside was enormous and silent, and somewhere out there in the dark, Garrett Pruitt was probably awake too, probably with people in his house, probably making plans. "Why did you really stop?" Clara asked. Devereaux looked at her. "When you saw what was happening here," she said. "You said you kept writing and then stopped. Men who wander aren't looking for trouble. You're not a young man trying to prove something. So why?" He took a long time with it, longer than his previous answers, which had been slow already. "I used to think I stopped being a lawman because I failed," he said. "Spent a few years believing that. Then I thought maybe I stopped because the system failed, because I worked inside something that was supposed to protect people and found out it mostly protected other things." He turned the coffee cup in his hands. "Now I think I stopped because I got tired. Not tired of the work, tired of moving through a country full of people who needed help, and convincing myself it wasn't my job anymore." Clara said nothing. The kitchen was very quiet. "You look like someone's daughter," he said, "and those men looked like men who were doing something they'd done before and never been stopped from doing." He set the cup down. "That's it. That's the whole answer." Outside, the nighthawk called again. Or maybe it was a different nighthawk. This far from town, in the dry dark, it was hard to tell the difference between things repeating and things just sounding the same. "They'll be back at first light," Clara said. "I know." "What do we do?" He looked at her across her father's kitchen table, in the light of her father's lamp, with her father's ledger somewhere out in the barn wrapped in oilskin, and he said, "We don't let them in." It wasn't a plan. It was barely a statement. But there was something in the way he said it, that same quality of stillness that had stopped Willis Rand's hand from tightening any further, that made it feel like something solid, something to stand on. Clara nodded. She refilled both cups. Outside, Domingo continued his quiet watch, and the dark country around the rocking W lay still and dry and full of things that hadn't happened yet but were absolutely going to. The spring was still there, cold and deep and patient in the rock. And so were they. Domingo didn't sleep. Clara knew this because when she finally gave up on rest around 3 in the morning and came back to the kitchen, she could see the orange tip of his cigarette moving in slow arcs in the dark by the barn, like a firefly that had forgotten how to be frantic. He'd been out there all night, and he'd be out there until the sun came up, and he wouldn't complain about it or explain it because Domingo didn't explain things. He just did them. Devereaux had taken the bunkhouse, or at least she'd told him to. Whether he'd slept was another question. When she stepped out onto the porch with her coffee at first light, he was already up, crouched by the water trough with the roan's front left hoof in his lap, checking the shoe with the focused attention of a man who understood that his horse's soundness was not a detail, but a necessity. He was talking to the horse in a low voice, not words she could make out, just the murmur of it, the tone that said, I know, we're going to need you today. The sky was going from black to a deep, bruised purple in the east. In an hour, it would be full light. In an hour and a half, probably less, the road would show riders. You sleep? She asked. Some, he said, not looking up from the hoof. That mean yes or no? Mean some. He set the hoof down and stood, brushing his hands on his pants. Coffee? She handed him her cup without thinking about it, and he drank from it without comment, which struck her as either very rude or very natural, depending on the kind of morning it was shaping up to be. He handed it back. I want to show you something, he said. He walked her out to the northwest corner of the property, where the land began to rise into the limestone shelf that ran across the back quarter of the rocking W. She'd walked this ground since she was small, knew every rock and scrub juniper and shadow, but she tried to see it the way he was seeing it, as terrain, as a problem with dimensions. The spring was set back into a natural bowl formed by 2 limestone formations that rose about 15 feet on 3 sides. Her father's collection basin was a flat concrete pool, roughly 10 feet across, fed from below by the fissure in the rock floor. In dry years, the water came up slow and cold and steady. In wet years, it overflowed and ran down the channel to the main trough. There was no dry year bad enough to stop it. That was the point. That was why Pruitt wanted it. Devereaux walked the perimeter of the bowl, taking his time. He tested the height of the limestone on the north side. He looked at the single approach path, a narrow cut between 2 boulders that was the only practical way in with horses. One way in, he said. One way in with animals, Clara said. A man on foot could come over the top on the south side, but it's a bad climb. How bad? My father broke 2 ribs doing it when he was 45. He was trying to show off for a ranch hand and misjudged the footing. She paused. He didn't try it again. Devereaux looked at the south wall. Still, a man desperate enough. A man desperate enough could do it, she agreed, but not quietly. He nodded, still looking. Then he said, if they come for the spring directly, this is where the fight happens. The main yard is a distraction. You think they'll split up? Rand's not going to ride his whole party up to your front door twice. He knows I'm here now. He knows the odds changed. He turned back toward the house. He'll put men on the spring while he talks to you. Maybe 2, maybe 3. The rest at the gate to keep you occupied. Clara thought about that. So we can't be in 2 places. You can't. He glanced at her. Domingo? Domingo is 61 years old. I know how old he is, Devereaux said mildly. That's not what I asked. Clara looked toward the barn, where the old man had finally come inside to drink something. He's the best shot on this property, she said. Better than me, and I'm not bad. What does he have? Winchester 73, and a shotgun that belonged to his father, which he treats better than he treats most people. Devereaux almost smiled again. He was doing that more often, she noticed. Not quite arriving at an actual smile, but getting closer. Put Domingo on the spring. You and I take the gate. And Petey? The name stopped him. The 14-year-old. Yes. He stays in the house with the door barred, Devereaux said, with a finality that didn't invite discussion. He is not part of this. He's going to argue. let him argue from inside a barred door. They walked back to the house together, and the sun was beginning to break over the eastern ridgeline, throwing long copper shadows across the yard. And Clara thought about her father standing on this same ground, watching the same sunrise and deciding, every single morning for 30 years, that this place was worth fighting for. She understood that decision in her bones. She'd inherited it along with everything else. Petey was awake and already furious by the time they got back. He was standing in the yard with his hair uncombed and his boots only half-laced, and the expression on his 14-year-old face was the expression of a boy who had decided he was a man and was prepared to argue the point. "I heard what they said yesterday," he announced, looking at Devereaux with a combination of suspicion and involuntary admiration that he was doing a poor job of concealing. "I can help." "You can help by staying inside," Devereaux said. "I can shoot." "I don't doubt it." "Then why—" "Because if something goes wrong," Devereaux said, with a patience that was clearly worn thin at the edges, "I need someone in that house who can get to Redemption Flat on foot and find the telegraph office. You know where the telegraph office is?" Petey blinked. He hadn't expected to be given a job. "Harmon's store, on the main street." "You know who to send a message to?" "No." Devereaux looked at Clara. She understood immediately. "Write it down," she told him. "The name and the message." He went inside and came back with a name written on a piece of brown paper. R. Aldous, Santa Fe, Federal Building, and a message in 6 words. Pruitt, Haskell County, Whitmore, come now, Devereaux. He folded it and gave it to Petey, who took it with the seriousness of someone receiving a dispatch rider's orders. "You don't go unless I tell you or Miss Whitmore tells you," Devereaux said. "And you don't come back with anything except the confirmation it was sent. Understood?" "Yes, sir," Petey said, and for once in his life managed to suppress the impulse to add anything to it. The riders came at 7:30. Not 6 this time. 9. Clara counted them from the porch as they came up the road, spread wide enough that they weren't a column, but an arrival. The kind of approach designed to feel like inevitability, like weather you couldn't avoid. Rand was in the front, and to his right was a man she didn't recognize. Taller than Rand, broader through the shoulders, with a gray hat pulled low and a way of sitting the saddle that said he was not a second in command. "Who's the new one?" she said quietly. Devereaux was standing to her left, slightly back, in the shadow of the porch overhang. "Caulfield," he said. The name meant nothing to her, but the way Devereaux said it, flat, controlled, with something working underneath it that he was keeping below the surface, told her it meant something to him. "You know him." "By reputation." "Good reputation or bad?" "Depends which side of him you're on." Rand pulled up at the gate and the riders spread behind him. 3 of them, Clara noticed immediately, didn't stop with the group. They curved around the left side of the yard toward the northwest, moving at a casual pace that was trying very hard to look like nothing in particular. "There," she said. "I see it," Devereaux said, and then, without moving his head, "Domingo." From somewhere near the barn, a low whistle. Domingo had seen it too. Rand rode to the gate and called across the yard. "Miss Whitmore, we'd like to finish our conversation from yesterday." "We finished it," Clara called back. My answer was no. Rand glanced at the man called Caulfield, who hadn't said anything yet. Caulfield was looking at the porch with the calm, assessing attention of a man who was costing someone money by the hour and knew it. His eyes moved from Clara to Devereaux and stayed there. "Mr. Devereaux," he said. His voice was unhurried, the kind of voice that had learned long ago that urgency was a disadvantage. "Been a while." "Caulfield, didn't expect to find you in New Mexico. World's full of surprises." Caulfield smiled at that, and it was not an unpleasant smile, which somehow made it worse. "Mr. Pruitt's asked me to extend his offer. He's a reasonable man. He understands that grief makes people dig in, hold on to things past the point of sense. He's willing to go to 1800. "Not for sale," Clara said. "Miss Whitmore." Caulfield turned his attention to her with the kind of careful courtesy that had a door behind it. "You are, if you'll forgive me saying, alone out here. Your foreman is an old man. You have a boy doing chores, and you've taken in a drifter whose goodwill may not extend as far as the trouble he's inviting." He paused. $1,800 is a new start somewhere that doesn't require you to spend every morning wondering what's coming up your road. I know exactly what's coming up my road, Clara said. I'm looking at it. Caulfield took a breath through his nose. Something shifted in his face, not anger exactly, more like the moment when a man stops trying one approach and starts calculating another. He looked back at Devereaux. Mr. Pruitt would like a word with you privately, Caulfield said. Man to man, he thinks there may be terms agreeable to both parties. Pruitt can come out here and say them himself, Devereaux said. That's not how Mr. Pruitt does things. I know how Pruitt does things, Devereaux said. That's why I'm standing here instead of riding over there. The pause that followed was the kind that counted seconds. Clara's hand was near the rifle she'd leaned against the wall beside the door, and she didn't move it closer because she didn't want to be the first one to escalate, but she didn't move it away either. From the northwest corner of the property, a sound carried on the morning air. A short, sharp exchange of voices, then silence. Then Domingo's whistle. 2 notes. That was the signal they'd agreed on. The signal that meant I have them and they know it. Caulfield heard it. His eyes shifted briefly northwest and came back. Your man's going to get himself hurt, he said, and this time the courtesy was thinner. My man can take care of himself, Clara said. More than I can say for yours right now. The 3 riders who had gone around the left side of the yard came back into sight, moving at a pace that was slightly faster than casual. They rejoined the group with the particular body language of men who had encountered something they hadn't expected and weren't sure how to report it. One of them leaned toward Rand and said something low. Rand's jaw tightened. Caulfield looked at Devereaux. Something had changed in his expression. The professional pleasantness had gone, and what was underneath it was less comfortable to look at. You know how this ends, he said. Most things end the same way, Devereaux said. Somebody decides it's not worth it. And you think that somebody's going to be us? I think Pruitt's made a calculation error, Devereaux said. I think he saw a woman alone in a dry summer and a water source worth money, and he ran the numbers the way he always runs them. But the numbers changed yesterday, and he hasn't adjusted for that yet. When he does, this conversation is going to look different. Caulfield studied him for a long moment. Then he looked at Clara. Then he looked at the gate, the yard, the barn, the northwest corner where the spring sat behind its limestone walls. He was doing the same kind of geometry Devereaux had done that morning, and Clara had the feeling he was arriving at some of the same conclusions. We'll give you until noon, Caulfield said. Don't bother, Clara said. Miss Whitmore, I said don't bother. My answer is no today, and it will be no at noon, and it will be no next week. If you'd like to spend the morning sitting on your horses in my road, that's your time to waste. She kept her voice level, which cost her something. Her hands were steadier than her chest felt. But I'm done talking. Caulfield held her gaze for 3 seconds, which felt like considerably longer. Then he pulled his horse's head around and moved back to the group. There was a brief, quiet conference. Clara couldn't hear the words, but she could read the posture, the small, sharp gestures. And then the riders began to pull out. Not a retreat exactly, more like a deliberate pause. The kind that said, this isn't over, we're just choosing when to continue it. They were gone in their own dust inside of 2 minutes. Clara let out a breath she'd been holding since Caulfield said man to man, and had to grab the porch railing for a second because her knees had quietly decided to stop doing their job without informing her. Devereaux looked at her. He didn't say anything about the railing. Domingo came around the corner of the barn, Winchester on his shoulder, moving in his unhurried way. 3 men, he reported. They got close enough to see the basin, not close enough to do anything about it. He looked at Devereaux. One of them had a measuring rope. A survey rope, Devereaux said. See. Clara straightened up from the railing. They're trying to establish that the spring is on the property line, or claim it crosses onto Pruitt's land. That's the legal play, Devereaux said. If they can get a surveyor, Calls or someone like him, to put the spring boundary on Pruitt's side of the line, it changes the conversation from intimidation to litigation. But the survey records can be altered, he said, without bitterness, just as fact. It's been done before in this county. Your father's ledger mentions calls for a reason. Clara absorbed that. She walked off the porch and stood in the yard, looking at nothing in particular, letting the implications settle. So they have 2 approaches, she said. Force and law. If force doesn't work, they file a survey dispute. And with Huck in their pocket, any legal proceeding in this county goes the way they want, Devereaux said. Yes. Then we need to get the ledger out of this county. We need to get it to Santa Fe, he said, but not through the mail and not through anyone Pruitt has influence over, which in this county means most of the official channels. Your contact, Aldous. If he gets Petey's message, and if he moves on it, he could be here in 3 days, maybe 4. 3 days is a long time. I know. She turned and looked at him directly. What did you do? The mistake you mentioned. The 3 people. He didn't look away, which she'd half expected him to do. He held her gaze and said, I was tracking a man named Voss, not connected to anyone in this county, different territory entirely. He was running a land fraud scheme not unlike Pruitt's, but with a violent edge. I had information that he was going to move against a family, homesteaders, husband, wife, 2 young children. I sent a wire to the county office, asked for backup, waited. He stopped. The wire went to the wrong office. The backup went to the wrong farm. By the time I got there alone, the husband was dead and the wife was shot. She lived. The children weren't harmed. He paused again. 3 people. I said 3 people. Clara waited. The wife miscarried 2 months later, he said. From the shock of it, the doc said. That's 3. The yard was very quiet. A meadowlark somewhere out in the brush was going through its repertoire, unconcerned with any of this. It wasn't your fault, Clara said. I know that, he said, and he said it in a way that made it clear knowing hadn't helped much. I misfiled the wire. Simple clerical error. The kind of thing that happens 100 times and 99 of them, nothing comes of it. He kicked a small rock. It skipped into the dirt. 99th time I didn't have a problem. The 100th time I did. And you left the service. Couldn't stay in it, he said. Not because they asked me to go. They didn't. They said it was an error in the system, not a failure of the officer. Very official, very clean. He looked at the horizon. But I knew what I knew, and I couldn't stand in front of another family needing protection and not think about that farm. Clara nodded. She understood something about that. The specific weight of feeling responsible for something you couldn't quite own entirely, but couldn't give away either. She'd spent 3 weeks since her father's death turning over the question of whether she should have pushed him harder to eat better, sleep more, worry less. You thought about Pruitt's offer, she said. He looked at her sharply. Caulfield said there were terms agreeable to both parties, she said. That means Pruitt made you an offer, not publicly, before this morning or during the conference just now. What did he offer you? Devereaux was quiet for a beat too long. Tell me, she said. Money, he said. $500 to take my horse and ride out. Leave you to it. $500. Clara thought about what $500 meant to a man wandering from town to town on a tired horse with trail dust worked into his coat. She thought about what it would feel like to be offered that, easy and clean, and no one asking anything of you but your absence. When? She said. One of Rand's men pulled me aside at the trough yesterday, after they left, while you were still on the porch. He said it without apology, just stating it plainly. I told him no. Why? Because I was already in it, he said. Because I'd already said the words, and if I took money to unsay them, I'd be the same as Huck and Calls and everyone else in your father's ledger. Just cheaper. Clara looked at him for a moment, then she went inside and came back with the coffee pot and 2 cups, and she poured them both without asking. And she sat down on the porch steps, and after a moment he sat beside her, and they drank their coffee in the morning heat and watched the road and said nothing for a while, because some things didn't require more words than they'd already been given. Petey appeared from around the back of the barn. He'd been told to stay in the house and had apparently decided the yard was close enough. He had his boots laced properly now, and his hair partially tamed and the piece of brown paper folded in his front pocket. They're gone? He asked. For now, Clara said. He looked at the road, then at the northwest corner of the property, then back at Clara. Miss Whitmore, he said, with the particular gravity of a boy who had decided something. My daddy used to work for Mr. Pruitt, before he left. Clara looked at him. This was new. I didn't know that. Feed and grain operation, 3 years ago. Petey pushed a boot toe through the dirt. He quit because Mr. Pruitt had him move some boxes from a storage building outside of town. He didn't know what was in them until one got dropped and busted open. He paused. Survey equipment, a lot of it, and papers that had county seal stamps on them that hadn't been filled in yet. Devereaux set his cup down slowly. Blank county documents with official seals. That's what my daddy said. He didn't know what they were for, but he knew it wasn't right, so he left. Petey finally looked up. He told me about it because he said if I ever worked for Miss Whitmore's family and something happened, I'd know what kind of man Mr. Pruitt was. The morning had gone very still around them. Petey, Devereaux said carefully, does your father know what he saw? He knows what he told me. Would he be willing to write it down, sign his name to it? The boy thought about it. He's scared of Pruitt, he said honestly. He's been scared since he left. That's why we don't talk about it out loud much, he paused. But he's more scared of what happens if Pruitt wins and there's nobody left to say anything. Clara reached over and put her hand briefly on the boy's shoulder. Go get your horse, she said. I need you to ride to your father's place and tell him what's happening out here. Don't go through town. Take the cut road by the wash. Can you do that? Yes, ma'am. Tell him we need his account in writing, signed, and tell him... She glanced at Devereaux. Tell him he's not the only one anymore. Petey was gone inside of 10 minutes, riding hard on the cut road with his boots laced properly and the piece of brown paper still in his pocket like a commission he hadn't completed yet. Devereaux watched him go. The boy's braver than he knows, he said. Most people are, Clara said. The sun was climbing and the heat was beginning to assert itself, and somewhere in the limestone bowl at the northwest corner of the rocking W, the spring continued its patient work, pushing cold water up through the fissure in the rock, filling the basin her father had built, indifferent to the men who wanted it, and the woman who was keeping it, and the drifter sitting on her porch who had decided, for reasons that made more sense to her now than they had yesterday, that leaving was no longer something he was willing to do. Domingo came and sat on the bottom step with his Winchester across his knees, and the three of them stayed like that in the climbing heat, watching the road, waiting for noon to come and go and tell them what kind of afternoon they were going to have. Around 11, a rider appeared on the road. Alone. Moving at a walk. Clara stood up. Devereaux was already on his feet. The rider wasn't one of Rand's men. She could tell that from a distance. The horse was wrong, a bay mare with a white blaze, and the rider sat slightly sideways in the saddle in the particular way of a person who had an old hip injury they'd learned to accommodate. She knew that mare and she knew that hip. Doc Hearn, she said. He was 68 years old and he rode like it, but he came up the road with a directness that said he hadn't come to make a social call. He pulled up at the gate and looked at the three of them on the porch and at the stranger standing behind them and said, without preamble, Pruitt's at the sheriff's office right now. I just came from Emmeline Voss, who had it from the land registry clerk, who is a cousin of hers and not in Pruitt's pocket. He paused to catch his breath. He's filing a boundary dispute against your northwest property line, effective today. Clara felt something cold move through her despite the heat. Calls? Devereaux said. Doc looked at him with the sharp attention of a man meeting someone unexpected. Who are you? Someone who knows the name Calls. Then you know he's back from Arizona, Doc said grimly. Arrived in town 2 days ago, and he's already been to see Huck. Clara looked at Devereaux. The timeline had just compressed. 3 days for Aldous to arrive from Santa Fe was 3 days they might not have, because a boundary filing in Huck's court could move fast when the judge owed his position to the man doing the filing. How long to get a federal injunction? She asked Devereaux. Depends who's asking and what they have, he said. With the right evidence and the right contact, maybe 2 days, maybe 1. Without... He didn't finish the sentence. Then we need to move the ledger, she said. Now. Today. Devereaux looked at Doc Hearn. You're willing to be here, he said. It wasn't quite a question. Doc straightened in his saddle. He was 68 years old and he had a bad hip, and he'd ridden out to the rocking W on a hot morning because Thomas Whitmore had been his friend for 30 years, and Thomas Whitmore's daughter was standing in the yard with her jaw set in exactly the way Thomas used to set his. Thomas told me a year ago he was building something, Doc said. I should have asked him more about it while I had the chance. He looked at Clara. Tell me what you need. The morning was burning away fast, and the road to town sat empty and quiet in both directions. And the spring in the northwest corner continued its patient upward push through solid rock, and there was a ledger in the barn wrapped in oilskin that 7 years of a dead man's careful work had filled. And somewhere on a horse on the cut road, a 14-year-old boy was riding hard toward a conversation that might add one more name to the list of people willing to say what they knew. It wasn't enough yet, but it was more than it had been yesterday, and yesterday had started with nothing at all. Doc Hearn didn't wait to be invited inside. He climbed down from his mare with the careful deliberateness of a man who had learned that rushing the dismount was how you ended up on the ground, handed the reins to Domingo without being asked, and walked up the porch steps like he'd been doing it for 30 years, which he more or less had. You need to understand what Pruitt filing today means, he said, settling into the chair Clara's father had built from cottonwood and rawhide sometime in the 1860s. It creaked under him the way it had always creaked. Huck won't wait for a hearing. He'll issue a temporary injunction against any transfer or use of the disputed water source pending resolution. That means if we try to move the ledger through any official channel, Clara said, we're already in violation of a court order before we start. Not quite. The injunction is against the water, not the property, but Huck will interpret it as broadly as Pruitt needs him to. Doc looked at Devereaux, who was standing near the window with his arms crossed, watching the road. Your federal contact, Aldous, how much does he know about Pruitt? He knows the name, Devereaux said. He knows the territory. He's been watching Haskell County for 2 years from a distance because he didn't have enough to move on. And the ledger gives him enough. The ledger plus Petey's father's account plus Call's being back in town. Devereaux turned from the window. Call's coming back is a mistake on Pruitt's part. The man's been in Arizona for 8 months specifically because his name is in that ledger. Bringing him back to file a fraudulent survey means Pruitt is impatient. Impatient men make additional mistakes. Doc looked at him steadily. You've dealt with men like Pruitt before. Enough times to know they're all the same underneath, Devereaux said. They believe the law is a tool, which it is. But tools work both ways. Clara had been standing in the kitchen doorway, listening and turning something over in her mind. She'd been turning it over since Doc said 2 days ago about Call's arriving in town. 2 days ago was the day after her father's funeral, the day she'd found the ledger in the desk. She hadn't told anyone about it that day. Not a soul. But that same day, 2 men at a feed store 30 miles away had been talking about the Whitmore Spring and the ledger, which was how Devereaux had heard it. Someone in this county told Pruitt about the ledger before I knew it existed, she said. Both men looked at her. My father died on a Thursday, she said. I found the ledger the following Saturday, but the conversation at the feed store in Mesquite Station, she looked at Devereaux. When exactly did you hear that? He thought back. Saturday, he said slowly. Late afternoon. Same day I found it. The kitchen was quiet. Doc shifted in the cottonwood chair. That means someone knew about the ledger before I found it, Clara said. Someone who knew where my father kept it, or at least that it existed. Or someone my father told, she added, and her voice did something complicated around the word told that she couldn't entirely prevent. Doc cleared his throat. Thomas was a careful man. He was, Clara said, but careful men still talk to someone. They have to. She looked at Doc directly, and she made herself keep her eyes on his face while she did it, which was one of the harder things she'd done that week. Did he tell you? Doc was quiet for a moment that lasted long enough to be its own kind of answer. Then he said, He told me there was documentation. He didn't tell me where it was or what exactly it contained. He said, He stopped, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he looked old. Not just 68 old. Old the way men got when they were carrying something they should have set down sooner. He said, if anything happened to him, I should make sure you knew to look. And did you? Clara said. Make sure I knew? I told you he was building something, Doc said. At the funeral. I thought... He pressed his lips together. I thought you'd understand. I found it by accident, Clara said. I was looking for a letter he might have written, something he'd left for me. She stopped. There was no letter. The silence that followed that particular sentence was the kind that nobody tried to fill, because there was nothing to put in it that would help. Devereaux moved away from the window. "Doc," he said, not unkindly, but with the directness of a man redirecting a conversation that was about to consume time they didn't have. "Who else did Thomas talk to, besides you?" Doc collected himself. "Emmeline Voss," he said. He trusted her judgment, and Croft, the banker, though I'm not certain how much he told Croft versus how much Croft observed on his own. Thomas did his banking there for 30 years. A man who looks at numbers all day notices things. Anyone connected to Pruitt? Anyone he might have trusted without knowing they were connected? Doc thought about it with the careful expression of a man running through 30 years of social geography. "Henry Marsh," he said finally, and he said it like it cost him something. "The land registry clerk, not the one who's Emmeline's cousin. The senior clerk, Marsh. Thomas used to play cards with him on Friday nights. 15 years they played cards. Is Marsh in the ledger?" Clara asked Devereaux. "I'd have to look again," Devereaux said, "but I don't recall the name." "That doesn't mean he's not connected," Clara said. "It might mean my father didn't know, or didn't have proof." Devereaux looked at her. "You've been thinking about this a while." "I've been thinking about this since you said someone was talking at a feed store 30 miles away," she said. "Pruitt doesn't run his operation without people inside the systems. The sheriff, the surveyor, the court. But he also needs people inside the information, people who hear things before they become official." "Marsh would hear everything that comes through the land registry," Doc said reluctantly. "Disputes, filings, ownership transfers." He paused. "He would have known about the boundary filing before Emmeline's cousin did." "Then Marsh knew about the filing before we did," Clara said. "And if he's connected to Pruitt, he told Pruitt about the ledger." "How?" Devereaux said. "If Thomas was careful." "Because my father trusted him," Clara said simply. 15 years of Friday night cards. At some point, men talk. Maybe my father said something oblique, something he thought was safe. Or maybe Marsh was watching and guessing and got close enough that Pruitt acted on the guess. Devereaux nodded slowly. He was doing that thing again, building the architecture of it, putting the pieces in their structural positions. "Which means Pruitt moved fast after Thomas died because he was afraid you'd find the ledger first." "He sent the polite man with the offer 3 days after the funeral," Clara said, "before I'd even finished sorting my father's papers. He was cleaning up loose ends." "He was," she said, "and he didn't expect me to say no." Doc made a sound that might have been a laugh if the circumstances had been different. "Thomas told me once that you were the most stubborn person he'd ever known, and he said it like a man who was very proud of a quality he'd spent 30 years trying to argue you out of." Clara didn't answer that. She turned away and looked out the kitchen window at the yard, at the barn, at the limestone ridge beyond the northwest corner where the spring sat in its bowl and went about its patient business. "We need to move the ledger today," she said, "before Huck's injunction has any teeth." "The problem," Devereaux said, "is that the road to Santa Fe goes through Redemption Flat, and Rand's men will be watching that road." "I know a way that doesn't go through Redemption Flat," Clara said. "It's longer, it's rough. It goes through the canyon country south of the Ortega Wash." "That's 3 days on that road," Doc said. "Minimum." 2.5 if the rider knows it," Clara said. Devereaux looked at her. "You know it." "My father used to take me hunting in that canyon when I was young. I know every wash and switchback." She held his gaze. "But I can't take the ledger and leave the spring undefended. And I can't send Domingo. He's the only gun I trust on the property right now." "Send me," Devereaux said. "You don't know the canyon." "Then you tell me how." "It's not the kind of thing you can tell," she said. "It's the kind of thing you have to have walked." They looked at each other, and the problem sat between them without a clean solution, which was how most real problems sat. "I'll go," Doc said. Both of them looked at him. He held up a hand before either could object. "I know the Ortega Wash, not as well as Clara, but well enough. And more to the point." He reached into his coat and produced a small leather case, which he opened to reveal a worn document with a federal seal. "I have a standing commission as a territorial medical examiner. Has been largely ceremonial for the past decade, but it gives me right of passage on federal roads, and it means that if Rand's men stop me, detaining me is a federal offense. He closed the case and put it away. I may be 68 years old with a bad hip, but I'm considerably harder to legally obstruct than most. Devereaux looked at the case, then at Doc's face, then at Clara. He's right about the commission, he said. That's not nothing. It's not nothing, Clara agreed. She looked at Doc with something in her expression that was hard to name. Not quite gratitude, because gratitude didn't cover it, and not quite grief, though that was in there too. You'd be riding 3 days in this heat. I've ridden worse and worse weather for people I cared considerably less about, Doc said, and the bluntness of it closed the argument. They spent the next hour preparing. Domingo retrieved the ledger from its place in the hay, and Clara added to it. A written account of the morning's events, the names of the riders, the survey rope, the filing she'd been told about through Emmeline's cousin. She wrote it in her father's desk in her father's hand, or as close to it as she could manage, and then she stopped and rewrote it in her own hand because falseness was the last thing this document needed. She signed her name and dated it. Devereaux watched her write. Add what Petey told you about his father, he said. His father's name and what he saw. Petey's father hasn't agreed, but he will, but if something happens before we get his signed account, we want a record that his testimony exists and where to find it. She added it. They wrapped the ledger and her account together in fresh oilskin, tied it with cord, and Doc put it in his saddlebag under his medical kit and a change of clothes and a bag of dried apricots that Domingo produced from somewhere in the barn and presented without commentary. At the gate, Doc mounted slowly and sat for a moment adjusting to the saddle. He looked down at Clara. I'll send word from the way station at Cañon Blanco, he said. 2 days in. You'll know I got that far. And if we don't hear from you, then something stopped me, he said, and you'll know what to do next. She wanted to say something better than what came out, which was just, be careful, which was barely adequate for what she was actually feeling. Doc seemed to understand the gap between the words and what they represented, because he nodded with the particular nod of a man who had been reading people for 68 years and had gotten reasonably good at it. He rode south, away from the Redemption Flat Road, taking the cut that swung behind the Ortega Wash. And Clara watched him until the dust settled, and then kept watching the empty air where the dust had been. He'll make it, Devereaux said behind her. You don't know that. No, he said, but he's harder to stop than he looks. She turned back to the yard. Now we wait. Now we prepare, he said. Waiting and preparing looked the same from the outside. What followed was the longest afternoon Clara could remember since the days immediately after her father's death, which had been long in a different way. Those had been long with grief, stretched and silent and full of small tasks she performed automatically, while some part of her mind refused to believe what had happened. This afternoon was long with vigilance. Every sound from the road, every shift of light across the limestone ridge, Domingo cycling through his watch positions with the systematic patience of a man who understood that attention was a physical resource and had to be managed accordingly. Devereaux spent part of the afternoon at the spring. Clara found him there when she went to check the basin level, a habit she'd maintained since her father taught her that the spring's output varied by season, and understanding those variations was part of understanding the property. He was sitting on the limestone rim of the collection basin with his boots off, which surprised her. His socks were drying on a rock beside him. Blisters, he said before she could ask. He said it like a man reporting a mildly irritating weather condition. She looked at his feet. The blisters were bad enough that she went back to the house for the medical tin and came back and crouched beside him and cleaned them without being asked, which he accepted without comment, though she could tell from the set of his jaw that the cleaning was not pleasant. You've been walking in wet boots, she said, creek crossing south of Mesquite Station. 3 days ago. Couldn't get them properly dry. You should have said something. Didn't seem relevant. A man who can't walk properly is relevant when he might need to run, she said. He looked at her. I won't need to run. Everyone eventually needs to run. Maybe, he said, but not this week. She bandaged the worst of them, and they sat for a while by the spring in the way people do when they've been tense for a long time, and the tension has briefly found no immediate target and doesn't quite know what to do with itself. The water in the basin was clear and cold and moved with a slight shimmer from the upwelling below. You couldn't hear it exactly. It was more that the sound of the world was slightly different here, cooler and quieter, as if the water had its own gravity that bent the air around it. My father found this when he was 26, Clara said. He was digging a post hole in the northwest corner and hit the rock shelf at 3 feet. He said the ground was wet under the rock and he followed the wet instead of putting in the post. She paused. He said that was the best decision he ever made except for marrying my mother. And my mother's been gone 17 years, so he said it outlasted her, and that was a hell of a thing. Devereaux looked at the water. He was right about it. He was right about most things, she said. Eventually, he was wrong about some things first and right about them later, which is maybe its own kind of wisdom. What was he wrong about? She thought about it honestly. He was wrong about Marsh, she said. He trusted him for 15 years, and if we're right about Marsh, that trust was the thing that cost him. Not his life, and his heart gave out on its own, but the security of what he'd built. She pulled her knees up and rested her arms on them. He spent 7 years building a record to protect this ranch and this valley, and the man he played cards with every Friday was giving information to the person that record was built against. Devereaux didn't offer her the reassurance she hadn't asked for, which she appreciated. He just let the thing sit at its actual weight. Is Marsh the kind of man who knew what he was doing? He asked. I don't know, she said. I want to say yes because it makes it simpler, but I've known Henry Marsh my whole life, and he's always seemed like a man who went along with things because going along was easier than not. That's its own kind of choice, but it's a different kind than Huck or Calls. Men who go along are the connective tissue, Devereaux said. The active criminals are the bones. But without the men who go along, the structure doesn't hold. My father used to say something like that, she said. He said the worst thing wasn't the men who did evil. It was the men who handed them the tools. They were quiet for a while. The sun was angling west and the limestone was beginning to hold the day's heat, releasing it slow and steady the way stone does, and the basin continued its patient filling. Petey came back at 4 in the afternoon. He came back fast, which meant something, and he came back alone, which meant something else. Clara heard the hooves on the cut road and was at the gate before he'd pulled up. His face was flushed from the ride and from something else, excitement or fear, or the particular combination of both that you couldn't always distinguish in a 14-year-old. My daddy'll do it, he said. He'll write it down and sign it. But he says he needs to do it somewhere that isn't his house and isn't here because both places are too easy to watch. Where does he suggest? Devereaux asked. Petey looked at him with the now familiar combination of suspicion and reluctant respect. Emmeline Voss's schoolhouse, he said. He knows her from years back. He says she's got a notary stamp, and she's the kind of woman Pruitt can't walk over without it costing him more than it's worth. Devereaux looked at Clara. He's right about that. Miss Voss has been a notary since 1879, Clara said. She notarized half the deed transfers in this county before Calls came along and started doing them wrong. She paused. Can your father be there tonight? She asked Petey. He said after dark, Petey said, when it's harder to see who's going where. Tell him yes, Clara said. We'll be there. Petey turned his horse and was gone again before the dust had settled from his arrival, and Clara stood in the road watching him go and thought about what her father had built. Not just the spring, not just the ledger, but the reputation, the relationships, the decades of being a man people trusted enough to tell things to and ask things of. She was drawing on that now, and she hadn't known until this week how much of it there was. Getting to Emmeline Voss's schoolhouse after dark meant leaving the ranch in Domingo's keeping, which Domingo received as information rather than as a question, setting his Winchester against the barn door and going to check on the horses the way a man checks on things he intends to be responsible for. Devereaux rode his roan. Clara rode her father's gray mare, which she hadn't ridden since the funeral and which picked up on her mood the way horses do, turning its head to look at her twice on the cut road as if checking whether everything was all right, which it decidedly was not. But Clara said, "We're fine anyway," because it seemed like the thing to say. They came into Redemption Flat from the south end, avoiding the main street and the sheriff's office and the land registry with its late light burning. The schoolhouse was on the eastern edge of town, set back from the road on a small rise. and Emmeline Voss was waiting for them at the door with a lamp that she turned low as soon as she saw them coming. She was 44 years old, Emmeline Voss. With iron gray hair she kept pinned back with the kind of determination that suggested it had tried to escape more than once. She taught 23 children 5 days a week, and on the other 2 days she was apparently running half the informal business of the county, based on what Clara was learning this week about who knew what. "Come in," she said, in the same tone she probably used for students who were late and knew it. She looked at Devereaux without introduction. "You're the drifter." "I've been called that," he said. "Are you?" "Not especially," he said. "Good," she said, and stepped aside to let them in. Warren Cale was already there. He was a broad-shouldered man, going gray at the temples, with hands that had done physical work for decades, and a face that showed what 3 years of being afraid of a powerful man did to a person over time. He stood up when Clara came in and then seemed uncertain what to do with himself. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I'm sorry about your father." "Thank you, Mr. Cale." "He was a decent man." He stopped. "I should have come to say that sooner." "You're saying it now," Claire said. "That counts." He sat back down and they got to work. Emmeline had paper and ink and her notary stamp, and Warren Cale told his account slowly and carefully, pausing at points to get the details exactly right. And Devereaux asked him 2 clarifying questions: the specific location of the storage building and the approximate quantity of blank documents, that tightened the account in ways that would matter when someone with legal authority read it. He wrote it in his own hand. He signed it. Emmeline stamped it and signed as witness. The whole thing took 40 minutes. The lamp burned low, and outside the schoolhouse the town was quiet in the way small towns got after 9 at night. Not peacefully quiet, just out of public view quiet, which wasn't the same thing. "Marsh is the one who told Pruitt," Warren Cale said when the documents were done. He said it like he'd been holding it and needed to put it down somewhere. "I saw them together once, about 2 years after I left the job, in a back room at the hotel. Marsh came out first and didn't see me. He looked like a man who'd just made a deal he wasn't sure about." He paused. "I didn't know what it meant at the time. I do now." Devereaux looked at Clara. She looked back at him. "Would you testify to that?" Devereaux asked Cale. "In a real court?" Cale said. "Federal?" "That's the one," Devereaux said. "Not Huck's court. Federal Circuit." Cale was quiet for a moment. He turned his hands over on the table, looking at them, which was something people did when they were deciding something and needed to feel their own physicality to do it. "If Pruitt is actually stopped," he said, "if there's a real proceeding and he can't reach into it." He looked up. "Yes." "Then we need to move fast," Devereaux said, "before he knows what we have." It was Emmeline who said the thing that needed saying, in the matter-of-fact tone of a woman who had been watching the situation build for longer than any of them knew. "Calls is staying at the hotel," she said. "Room 6. He arrived with a leather satchel that he won't let out of his sight, which means the fraudulent survey materials are in that room." She looked at Devereaux steadily. "I'm not suggesting anything illegal." "Of course not," Devereaux said. "I'm simply noting that a man who commits fraud while staying at a public establishment sometimes leaves evidence in places that a legitimate inquiry might locate." "That's very specific non-suggestion," Devereaux said. "I'm a school teacher," Emmeline said. "Specificity is my profession." On the ride back to the Rocking W, with the documents folded inside Clara's coat against her chest, Devereaux rode quietly for a while before he said, "We're close." "We're getting close," Clara said. "That's not the same as being there." "No," he said, "but it's the right direction." The road was dark and the stars were enormous overhead, the way they got in dry country away from town lights, and the horses moved through the dark with the comfortable authority of animals who trusted their feet more than their eyes. And Clara thought about her father playing cards on Friday nights with a man who was selling him out, and she thought about the spring and its limestone bowl, and she thought about Aldous in Santa Fe, who had not yet received a message that a 14-year-old boy was carrying in his pocket, and she thought about Doc Hearn somewhere on the canyon road, with saddlebags full of 7 years of careful documentation. Then she stopped thinking about all of it, because the Rocking W gate came into sight, and Domingo was standing at it with his Winchester and his lamp, and behind him the ranch sat quiet and intact, which tonight was enough. She was unsaddling the gray mare when she heard it, faint, from the northwest corner, barely audible above the horse's breathing. A sound that wasn't wind and wasn't animal. She looked at Devereaux over the saddle. He'd heard it too. His hand was already moving. "Someone's at the spring," she said. Devereaux was moving before Clara had finished the sentence. He went low and fast along the barn wall, not running exactly, but covering ground in a way that made very little noise, one hand on the revolver at his hip without drawing it. Clara tied the gray mare's reins to the post and followed, and Domingo materialized from the gate post the way he always materialized, as if he'd been standing exactly there all along and everyone had simply failed to notice. The sound came again, from the northwest. Metal on rock, very faint. The kind of sound a man makes when he's trying not to make sound and doesn't quite succeed. Devereaux stopped at the corner of the barn and held up one hand without turning around. Clara and Domingo stopped. The three of them stood in the dark and listened, and the night gave them back the sound of a light breeze in the juniper scrub and the distant call of something hunting and nothing else for a long moment. Then a voice, low, 2 words, and another voice answering. Devereaux turned back to them. He held up 2 fingers. 2 men. Clara pointed toward the south side of the limestone shelf, the bad climb, the one her father had broken ribs on. She held up her hand flat and moved it in a slow arc to indicate coming from that direction. Someone had gone over the top in the dark. Devereaux's jaw tightened. Going over the south wall in darkness was either desperate or confident, and desperate men and confident men were both dangerous, but in different ways. He looked at Domingo, then pointed northwest, then made a circling gesture to indicate going around to the east approach, while Devereaux took the direct line through the cut between the boulders. Domingo nodded once and moved off into the dark like smoke. Devereaux looked at Clara. She could see him deciding something she wasn't going to like. "Stay here," he said. "No." "Clara, this is my land and my spring," she said, quietly, but with a firmness that ended the sentence the way a period ends a sentence. "I know that bowl better in the dark than you do in daylight. You need me." He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then he turned and moved northwest, and she followed. The cut between the boulders was narrow enough that they had to go through single file, and the moonlight was partial, enough to see shapes but not details, which meant anyone in the bowl could see them as shapes too. Devereaux stopped just before the cut opened into the limestone bowl and pressed himself against the rock, and Clara came up beside him and looked through. 2 men. One was crouched at the edge of the collection basin with something in his hands. Too dark to see what, but the shape of it suggested a jar or a container. The second was standing back near the south wall with a rifle held loosely at his side, watching the approach path. Not Rand's men. She didn't recognize them. Smaller operation. 2 men sent quietly in the night, while Rand kept their attention during the day. Devereaux's mouth was very close to her ear. "The one at the basin is putting something in the water." The cold that moved through her then had nothing to do with the night air. "Poison," she breathed. He didn't confirm it because he didn't need to. If the spring was poisoned, the water was useless. If the water was useless, the land value dropped to almost nothing, and Pruitt could come in with a lowball offer and call it generous, and there would be nothing left to fight over. It was clean and it was patient, and it was exactly the kind of move a man made when he was tired of the direct approach and wanted the thing done quietly. Devereaux pulled his revolver. Then he did something she didn't expect. He handed it to her. She took it automatically. He picked up a rock from the ground beside him. Not large. Enough. He stood up and threw it hard against the far limestone wall, 15 feet to the right of the entrance, and in the half-second that both men turned toward the sound, he went through the cut at a dead run. He hit the man at the basin first. Not with the finesse of a man with something to prove, but with the blunt practical force of a man who needed the threat neutralized before it could act. The container went one direction and the man went another, and Devereaux had him face down on the rock with his arm wrenched behind him before the second man had finished turning. "Drop the rifle," Devereaux said. The second man had his rifle up. He was younger than Clara had guessed from his shape, maybe 20, maybe less, with a face that hadn't finished deciding what kind of man it was going to be. He looked at the man pinned on the ground. He looked at Clara, who had come through the cut and was holding the revolver in both hands the way her father had taught her, elbows slightly bent, weight forward. She wasn't shaking. That surprised her a little. He said, "Drop it," she said. The rifle came down. Not immediately. There was a beat of calculation, the boy running numbers in his head, but it came down. He set it on the rock and straightened up and put his hands at his sides and said, "I'm just hired work. I don't even know what's in that jar." "Then you made a bad employment choice," Clara said. Domingo came over the east approach. She heard him rather than saw him, and arrived in the basin with his Winchester and took custody of the situation with the competent ease of a man who had handled difficult things before and knew how to stand in a way that communicated this without speeches. Devereaux let the first man up. He was heavy-set, 40 or so, with a face that had been through several rearrangements and had come through all of them looking roughly the same. He looked at Devereaux with the resigned expression of a man who had survived encounters before by correctly identifying when the math was against him. "Where's the jar?" Devereaux said. Clara found it. It had landed against the basin wall without breaking. Heavy glass, corked, about half full of a dark liquid that even from a distance had the sharp quality of something chemical. "Don't open it," Devereaux said. She didn't. She held it carefully by the base, away from herself, and looked at it in the moonlight. The jar had no label. The dark liquid was viscous and moved slowly when she tilted it slightly, and she stopped tilting it. "Who sent you?" Devereaux asked the heavy-set man. "Same man who pays most of the working men in this county," he said, without particular effect. "Pruitt gave the order directly?" "Orders came through Rand." "Did Rand tell you what this was?" "Said it was something to make the water taste bad. Said the spring would test wrong after, and the woman would have to admit the water wasn't usable." He paused. "I figured that was a simplified version." "That is a very simplified version," Devereaux said. Clara was looking at the man. He wasn't apologetic exactly, but he wasn't defiant either. He was the kind of man who took jobs and did them, and didn't spend much time constructing moral frameworks around the doing. She'd met men like that before. The frontier was full of them. "You're going to tell me your name," she said, "and you're going to tell me who else Rand has working tonight, and then you're going to sit against that wall until morning." The man looked at her. He seemed to be adjusting his picture of what she was. "Name's Fossey," he said. "The kid's name doesn't matter. He's new. I don't know who else Rand has out." "That's the truth. We don't get briefed like an army." "Where are your horses?" "Tied on the south side, bottom of the wall." Clara looked at Devereaux. "We tie them and take the horses." He nodded. "And the jar goes with us, sealed." "Evidence," she said. "Yes." The word hung in the air between them with the particular weight of a thing that was accumulating. The ledger, Warren Cale's account, Emmeline's notary stamp, the survey rope that Domingo had seen, and now a sealed jar of poison that someone had tried to introduce into a water source at 2 a.m. Each piece was one piece. Together, they were becoming something with mass. They secured Fossey and the boy against the wall with cord from the barn. Domingo's inexhaustible supply of cord from Domingo's inexhaustible supply of barn resources. And Clara went to the collection basin and checked it carefully with her lamp. The lip of the basin was dry. Fossey had been crouched at the edge but hadn't yet opened the jar. The water was untouched. She put her hand in the basin and felt the cold water moving up from below, steady and patient as it had always been. And she held her hand there longer than was strictly necessary. They were back at the barn by midnight. Devereaux wrapped the jar in cloth and put it in the tack room on a high shelf and wrote, "Do not open" on the cloth in pencil, which was either very careful or slightly unnecessary, given that no one present needed the instruction, but she understood why he did it anyway. Documentation was becoming a habit. "Rand is escalating," Clara said. "He's not escalating," Devereaux said. "Pruitt is escalating. Rand does what he's paid to do." The jar idea came from someone who thinks in terms of quiet damage, long-term, deniable, the kind of harm that looks like nature if you don't know to look for it. He poured water from the house pitcher into his cup and drank. "Rand doesn't think that way. That's Pruitt." "He's panicking." "He's adjusting," Devereaux said. "There's a difference. Panicking men make obvious moves. Pruitt made a quiet move tonight. He's not panicking yet." He set the cup down. "But he's running out of quiet moves." Clara sat down at the kitchen table with her lamp and her cold coffee and the night pressing in around the house, and she tried to think about what Pruitt had left. Force was losing its edge. Devereaux had neutralized Rand twice now, without escalating to shooting, which made it harder for Pruitt to position himself as the aggrieved party in any legal proceeding. The boundary filing was in motion, but the ledger was on its way to Santa Fe, which undercut the legal play. The water poisoning had failed. What did that leave? "He'll go after the witnesses," she said. Devereaux, who had been about to sit down, didn't sit down. "Warren Cale," she said. "He signed his name tonight. Pruitt has men watching things in this county. Someone saw us go to the schoolhouse. Maybe not inside, but they saw where we went and who was there." She looked at him. "Cal goes home tonight and he's exposed." Devereaux was already moving toward the door. "Domingo!" Domingo appeared with the particular speed of a man who had not actually been far away. Devereaux spoke to him quickly, and Domingo nodded and went to saddle his horse, and in under 10 minutes he was gone down the cut road toward the Cowell property with his Winchester across his saddle and his dried apricots, because Domingo took provisions seriously. "Will he be in time?" Clara asked. "Domingo moves fast when he needs to," Devereaux said, "and Pruitt's men, if they're watching, have to ride back to report and then wait for an order. That's 3 steps. Domingo's 1. She nodded. The kitchen felt large without Domingo in it, which was strange because Domingo was not a large man. He just had a presence that made spaces feel inhabited. "Tell me about Aldous," she said. "The real version, not the version you told Petey." Devereaux sat down now. He was tired. She could see it in the way he sat, the slight forward lean of a man whose back had been asking for a chair for several hours. "Ray Aldous," he said. "We worked together for 4 years. He's 7 years older than me, been in federal service since before the war. He's not a political man. He doesn't care about who owes what to whom in Washington. He cares about his territory and the law as he understands it, which is the law without the edges sanded off." "Is he effective?" "When he has the tools," Devereaux said. "He's been watching this corner of New Mexico for 2 years because someone told him something was wrong in Haskell County. He doesn't know who, and I don't know who. It might have been your father through some channel I'm not aware of, but he's been waiting for something concrete." "The ledger is concrete." "The ledger, Cale's account, the jar, the survey rope." He paused. "If Petey got the message sent, Aldous will move. If the message got through, that is." "If it," she said. "There are a lot of ifs in this," he said. "I want to be straight with you about that." "I appreciate straight," she said. He looked at her across the table. The lamp between them was burning low, and she hadn't trimmed it, and neither had he, and the light was getting orange and close. "Your father built something over 7 years," he said. "That takes a particular kind of faith, the belief that truth, assembled carefully enough, eventually lands somewhere useful." "He had that kind of faith," Clara said. "I'm not sure I have it naturally. I think I'm borrowing it from him." "That's what inheritance is," Devereaux said. "Using what someone built before you understood what it was for." She trimmed the lamp. They sat with that for a while. It was around 2 in the morning when the sound came from the road. Not hooves this time. A single horse, moving fast, and then stopping at the gate, and then a voice she knew calling her name. Petey. She was at the gate before Devereaux had cleared the porch. The boy was on his horse, and he'd been riding hard, and he had dust on his face and an expression she couldn't immediately read, somewhere between frightened and lit up with something urgent. "The message got through," he said. "Harmon confirmed it sent, but on the way back—" He stopped and caught his breath. "Miss Voss sent her nephew to find me. She said Huck came to the schoolhouse tonight, after we left. She wouldn't let him in, but he served papers through the door." Clara felt the cold again. "What kind of papers?" "An order," Petey said, "against you, saying you have to appear before Huck's court tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, or he'll issue a warrant." "On what grounds?" Petey reached into his coat and came out with a folded paper that Emmeline Voss had sent with her nephew. Clara took it and read it in the gate lamp's light, and Devereaux read it over her shoulder. The grounds were trespassing on disputed land. The disputed land was the northwest corner of the Rocking W, the corner where the spring was. Huck had moved the boundary filing to an emergency hearing and had issued an immediate order restricting access to the disputed parcel pending resolution. And since Clara had been observed accessing that parcel this evening, by whom, The order didn't specify. She was in contempt unless she appeared and submitted to the court's jurisdiction. He's forcing you in front of Huck, Devereaux said. If I appear, Huck rules against me, Clara said. If I don't appear, Huck issues a warrant and Rand comes out here with a legal instrument. Either way, Pruitt gets access to the spring, Devereaux said. She handed the paper back to Petey, who was watching her with the focused attention of someone who understood more than his age officially entitled him to. How long until morning? She asked. 7 hours, Devereaux said. 7 hours. Aldous was somewhere between here and Santa Fe. Doc Hearn was somewhere in the canyon country south of Ortega Wash. Domingo was at the Cali property. Warren Cale had a signed account with a notary stamp on it. She had a poison jar on a shelf in the tack room and a spring that was still clean and cold in its limestone bowl. I need to send another message, Devereaux said. Not to Santa Fe. To the Federal Circuit office in Las Cruces. There's a duty officer. Aldous mentioned him once. His name is Reese. If I can get word to Reese tonight about the hearing and the fraudulent filing, he can issue a federal hold on any county court proceeding in a land dispute with federal land implications. Can he do that by 9 in the morning? If the right information gets to him tonight and he moves on it immediately. He paused. That's 2 ifs. Better than 1, she said. Petey, Devereaux said. The boy straightened. You're going back to Harmon's telegraph office. It's the middle of the night, Petey said. Harmon closes at 8. Harmon has a night wire for emergency federal communications, Devereaux said. Every telegraph office in the territory does. He'll open for it. How do I make him open for it? Devereaux reached into his coat and came out with a card. It was worn at the edges, and the printing on it was faded, but the federal seal in the corner was still legible. He handed it to Petey. Show him that and tell him it's a federal emergency communication regarding a fraudulent court proceeding. He's legally obligated to open the night wire. Petey looked at the card. This is your old deputy commission. It's still valid, Devereaux said, and he said it in a way that suggested he hadn't thought about that fact until just now and found it complicated. Petey tucked the card into his pocket with the specific carefulness of someone handling an object they understand to be important. He looked at Clara. Should I come back after? Go to Miss Voss's house after, Clara said. Not here. If things go wrong in the morning, we may need you there. He nodded and turned his horse, and for the second time that night she watched him ride away on the cut road and felt the particular vulnerability of having sent a 14-year-old to carry weight that adults had failed to pick up themselves. Devereaux was composing the message in his head. She could see it, the slightly distant expression of a man assembling precise language. He went to the kitchen and wrote it out on brown paper, reading it back to himself twice, and crossing out 2 words and replacing them with shorter ones, because telegraph messages were charged by the word, and because Devereaux apparently understood that brevity was its own kind of precision. She read it over his shoulder. Federal hold requested. Haskell County District. Fraudulent land filing pending. Survey evidence compromised. Calls surveyor material witness. Hearing 9 a.m. Act tonight or proceeding invalid. Devereaux. Deputy Commission 1874 to 1885. 1885, she said. I left in April of 85, he said. Commission was never formally revoked. They asked me to stay. I didn't. He folded the paper. Whether Reese honors a commission from a man who walked away is an open question, but worth trying. Everything worth doing has an open question in it, he said. Otherwise it would have been done already. She almost smiled at that. It was the most philosophical thing she'd heard him say, which wasn't saying much, but it was something. Dawn came the way dawn came in dry country. Gradually and then all at once, the sky going from black to a purple gray to a sudden hard brightness that left no room for transition. Clara had not slept. She knew Devereaux hadn't because she could hear him moving in the bunkhouse at intervals throughout the night. Not restless moving, just the steady movement of a man keeping watch in a building while someone else kept watch outside. Domingo came back at 5:30, riding slowly and with the deliberate pace of a man who had been awake all night and was managing his energy with the kind of economy that came from 61 years of hard experience. He unsaddled his horse, watered it, came to the kitchen, drank 2 cups of coffee in silence, and reported. Cale is safe, he said. 3 men came to his road around midnight. Saw me on the porch. He looked at his coffee cup. They did not come further. Did they try to talk to you? Clara asked. No. Where are they now? Gone by 2, he said. I stayed until 4. And Kyle? His wife wanted to feed me, Domingo said, with the slight expression of a man who had accepted the food and wasn't sorry about it. She makes good biscuits. At 7 o'clock, Emmeline Voss arrived on foot. She walked the mile from town to the rocking W at 7 in the morning in her good boots with a leather satchel over her shoulder and the expression of a woman who had made a decision and wasn't interested in discussing whether it was wise. I'm coming to court with you, she said. Emmeline, Clara started. I am a notary public and a county resident of 18 years, and I witnessed a legal account signed by a material witness last night, and I have every right to present that account to any court proceeding in this county, fraudulent or otherwise. She set her satchel on the porch step. Furthermore, I sent messages last night to the Halbert family, the Lena family, and 2 other former landholders whose properties appear in your father's ledger, which you described to me in sufficient detail last night for me to know what it contains, asking them to be at the courthouse at 9 if they believed justice was being done to them. The porch went quiet. You did that last night? Devereaux said. I did that last night, Emmeline said, while you were dealing with whatever was happening at the spring, which I didn't ask about because I thought my time was better spent on what I could do. Clara looked at her. She looked at Devereaux. He looked back at her with an expression that for once was not carefully controlled. It was just surprised, which on his face was a notable event. How many of them will come? Clara asked. 3 for certain, Emmeline said. Possibly 5. The Halberts have 4 adult children who remember very clearly what happened to their parents' land. She paused. A fraudulent court proceeding with 5 witnesses to related fraud in the public gallery is a different animal than a fraudulent court proceeding in an empty room. Huck will try to clear the gallery, Devereaux said. He can try, Emmeline said. Removing members of the public from a county court session requires a specific order, which has to be entered in the record, which creates documentation of the removal, which is itself evidence of irregularity. She folded her hands. I've been watching Henry Huck abuse his court for 6 years. I know exactly what he can and cannot do inside his own jurisdiction. Devereaux looked at her for a long moment. You should have been a lawyer, he said. I know, she said pleasantly. The profession doesn't accept women. It's their loss. It was 5 minutes to 8 when Petey appeared on the road, not riding this time, but walking fast, and the expression on his face was the kind that made Clara's chest tighten before he'd said a word. Harmon sent the wire, he said, breathing hard from the walk. But the response came back 40 minutes later. He pulled a paper from his pocket. Duty Officer Reese is not in Las Cruces. He's in El Paso. Won't be back until Thursday. Thursday was 4 days away. Is there a deputy duty officer? Devereaux asked. The response says the deputy duty officer is covering Las Cruces and Doña Ana County proceedings only until Reese returns. Petey looked up from the paper. He said he can't authorize a hold on Haskell County proceedings without Reese's signature. The morning had become very bright and very still. In an hour, Clara was supposed to be standing in front of Dale Huck's court with no federal hold, no Aldous, no Reese, and a ledger somewhere in the canyon country on the back of a 68-year-old doctor with a bad hip. What she had was a notary public with a leather satchel, a signed account from a frightened man who had found his nerve, a sealed jar of poison in a tack room, and a drifter who hadn't slept and whose federal commission was 11 years expired. Devereaux was looking at the road to town. Then we go to court, he said. His voice had the quality she'd first heard from him across a sunlit yard. The 3 words spoken without heat, without urgency, the way you'd tell a dog to get off the furniture, the quality of a man who had already finished the calculation and was simply reporting its result. Clara straightened up. She went inside and put on the coat she wore to town. It was her father's coat, slightly too large, and she'd been wearing it since the funeral because it was warm and because it smelled faintly of him still, which she was not ready to give up. She checked her reflection in the window glass and looked back at a woman she mostly recognized, and then she went back outside. "Emmeline," she said, "walk with me." The walk to town was 1.25 miles on the main road, and Clara walked it with Emmeline on her left and Devereaux on her right, and Petey half a step behind, and nobody said much because there wasn't much left to say that hadn't already been said in the long hours before dawn. The morning was already hot, the kind of hot that arrived early in August and didn't apologize for it, pressing down on the road and the dust and the dry scrub on either side. Clara kept her father's coat on anyway. It wasn't rational. She kept it on. Redemption Flat was a town of 400 people on a good day, and on a Tuesday morning in August, most of those people were doing what they normally did: feed store, dry goods, the livery at the south end of Main Street, where two men were arguing about a harness repair in a way that suggested the argument had been ongoing for some time. But there was a quality to the morning that Clara recognized immediately as people knowing something was happening and watching sideways to see how it went. Curtains, doorways with men standing in them who had no obvious reason to be standing in doorways. Huck's courthouse was not a proper courthouse. It was a building that had been a land office until 1879 and had been converted by the addition of a judge's bench, 12 spectator chairs, and a territorial seal nailed slightly crooked above the door. Huck had never bothered to straighten the seal, which Clara's father had said told you everything you needed to know about how Dale Huck thought about the law. There were already people on the steps. Clara counted. The Halbert boy. Not a boy anymore. He was 30-something, but she'd always thought of him as the Halbert boy. Was there with two of his sisters. An older man she recognized as Nate Lena, whose family had lost the Lena property 4 years ago in the proceedings nobody had understood. Two other people she didn't immediately place. And standing slightly apart from the group, with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who had made a decision he couldn't unmake and was living with it, Warren Cale. He met her eyes when she came up the steps. "I thought about going home," he said. 3 times between 2 in the morning and sunrise. I thought about it seriously. "But you're here," Clara said. "My wife told me," he said, "that she was tired of watching me be afraid of a man who'd already taken everything he was going to take from us." He paused. "She's smarter than me. Always has been." Clara put her hand briefly on his arm. Then she went inside. The room smelled of old paper and lamp oil, and the particular staleness of a space that was only aired out when official business required it. The 12 spectator chairs were filling up, the Halbert and Lena families taking seats along the left wall, Emmeline positioning herself at the small table usually reserved for recording clerks, opening her leather satchel with the deliberate calm of a woman who had been the most prepared person in every room she'd ever entered. Huck was already at the bench. He was a man of 52 with a face that had chosen fleshy some years ago and had committed to that choice fully. He had small eyes that moved quickly and a mouth that smiled easily and meant nothing by it. He looked at the filling gallery with those quick eyes, and the smile went briefly to something else before coming back. Garrett Pruitt was in the room. Clara had seen him before. Everyone in the county had seen him. But seeing him in this context, seated to the right of the bench in a chair that had been placed there specifically for him by someone who understood that was where he wanted to be, was different. He was 60 years old, heavy-set without being soft, dressed in the kind of clothes that said money without announcing it. He had the face of a man who had spent 4 decades getting what he wanted and had developed the serenity that came from that consistency. He looked at Clara when she came in, and the look was not hostile. It was something closer to puzzled, the way a man looks at a problem that keeps refusing to resolve itself by the expected method. Willis Rand was standing against the right wall. Caulfield was beside him. Neither of them looked at Devereaux, which was its own kind of look. Devereaux sat in the back row. He told Clara on the walk over that he was going to sit in the back, and she'd asked why, and he'd said because the back was where you could see everything, which was not the full answer, but was enough of it. Huck called the session to order with a gavel that he hit the bench with harder than was necessary, which was either his normal habit or a statement about the crowd. "This is a preliminary hearing on a boundary dispute filing, case number." He read a number that meant nothing to anyone. "Regarding the northwest parcel of the property known as the Rocking W, currently held by Clara Whitmore. We are here to address the temporary injunction issued yesterday and to receive—" "Your Honor," Emmeline's voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. It had the quality of a schoolteacher's voice. which was a voice trained to cut through noise without raising itself. "I'd like to enter a notarized account into the record before proceedings begin." Huck looked at her. "Miss Voss, this is a land dispute hearing. Notarized accounts regarding other matters are not—" "The account pertains directly to the survey filing at the basis of this dispute," Emmeline said. "It is a signed and notarized statement from a witness who observed materials relevant to fraudulent survey preparation being stored on property connected to the filing party." She opened her satchel and produced Warren Cale's account, 3 pages, and set it on the table in front of her. "Entered by a notary public in good standing with the Territorial Registry. I'm prepared to provide my credentials." Huck's jaw moved. "This is irregular." "Fraud is irregular," Emmeline said pleasantly. "The account simply documents it." Pruitt leaned slightly forward in his chair. It was a small movement, but Clara caught it. She'd been watching him since she sat down because she understood that in this room, whatever happened would happen according to what Pruitt decided to let happen. And watching him was watching the actual decision-making in real time. "Your Honor," said a voice from the doorway. Everyone turned. The man in the doorway was not Ray Aldis. He was younger than Aldis would have been, mid-30s, lean, with a federal marshal's badge on his coat and trail dust on his boots that said he had ridden through the night to be here. Behind him was another man, older, carrying a leather bag. "Deputy Marshal Cord Tanner," he said. "Federal Circuit, Las Cruces office. I have a communication from Deputy Commissioner Aldis in Santa Fe requesting a federal review of all proceedings in this court relating to any land filing in Haskell County made in the past 90 days. He walked to the bench and laid a document in front of Huck. "Effective immediately, this proceeding is stayed pending federal review. The filing party's surveyor, a Mr. Calls, is requested to make himself available for federal interview." The room went absolutely silent. Clara heard Devereaux exhale, slowly, from the back row. It was the only sound. Huck stared at the document. He picked it up. He read it in the way of a man hoping that reading something carefully enough would change what it said. It didn't change. He set it down. "This court," he started, "does not have jurisdiction to override a federal circuit stay," Tanner said, without hostility and without apology. "That's not a judgment on this proceeding, Your Honor. It's the law." Pruitt stood up. The room watched him stand up. He was the kind of man who, when he stood in a room, changed the weight distribution of the room. He'd been doing that for 40 years, and he knew exactly the effect it had. And for a moment, the room did what it always did when Garrett Pruitt stood up, which was hold its breath. "Marshal Tanner," he said, "I don't know what communication you've received or from whom, but I assure you that this proceeding is entirely within county jurisdiction and that any federal involvement is—" "Mr. Pruitt," Tanner looked at him directly. He was 35 years old, and he had probably been looked at by men like Pruitt before and had learned that the looking didn't change the law. "I have a separate communication for you. It's from Deputy Commissioner Aldis's office, and it requests your voluntary appearance in Santa Fe for an interview regarding land acquisition practices in Haskell County over the past decade." Pruitt went very still. "Voluntary," he said. "At this time," Tanner said. "Yes." The word "at this time" was doing considerable work in that sentence, and everyone in the room who was paying attention heard it. Rand had moved slightly away from the wall. Caulfield had not moved at all, which was more telling. Caulfield was the kind of man who understood when a situation had tilted past the point where positioning yourself differently would help. "I'll need to consult with my attorney," Pruitt said. "Of course," Tanner said. Pruitt walked out of the room. He walked out the way he'd entered every room for 40 years, with the confidence of a man who expected to return to it shortly, on his own terms, having resolved whatever minor inconvenience had presented itself. But the door closed behind him, and the room let out its breath, and it wasn't the same room anymore. Huck looked at the document in front of him for a long moment. Then he looked up at the gallery. The Halbert family, the Lena family, Warren Cale, Emmeline with her leather satchel, Clara in her father's coat. He looked at all of it, and his small eyes made the calculation that small eyes in small positions make when the larger position they've been orbiting suddenly shows signs of collapse. "This hearing is stayed," he said, "pending federal review." He hit the bench with his gavel once, sharply, and got up and left through the door behind the bench, and nobody stopped him. The room began to move again, people talking, the Halbert boy turning to his sisters, Warren Cale sitting down in a chair and putting his head in his hands. Not from despair, but from the particular physical relief of a man who has been holding something heavy for a very long time and has just been told he can put it down. Clara sat still. Devereaux came forward from the back row and stood beside her. He didn't say anything immediately. She appreciated that. "Aldous moved fast," she said when she could. "He was already moving," Devereaux said. "The message from Petey got to him yesterday afternoon. He must have sent Tanner overnight." He paused. "Tanner rode hard. What happens now?" "Tanner takes a statement from you today, and from everyone in this room who has one to give." He glanced at Emmeline, who was already speaking quietly with Tanner's companion, the older man with the leather bag, who appeared to be a federal recorder. "The ledger, when Doc gets it to Santa Fe, becomes the backbone. Cale's account, the jar, the survey rope, the Halbert and Lena grievances, those become the supporting structure." "And Pruitt?" Devereaux looked at the door Pruitt had walked out of. "He won't run," he said. "Men like him don't run. They fight through lawyers and influence and procedural delay for as long as those tools work. But the tools work less well when the federal circuit is involved, and when there are 7 documented victims in a room who are no longer afraid to say what happened to them." "Huck?" "Huck will cooperate when he understands the alternative," Devereaux said. "He's not a man of conviction. He'll go whichever direction the wind blows hardest." Clara turned and looked at the room. Tanner was listening to the older Halbert woman with the focused attention of someone taking real notes. Emmeline was producing documents from her satchel with the systematic efficiency of a woman who had been organizing other people's lives for 40 years. Warren Cale was talking to Nate Lena in the low voice of 2 people discovering they'd been living in adjacent versions of the same bad situation. Petey was in the doorway, still holding Devereaux's old deputy card, looking at all of it with 17-year-old eyes on a 14-year-old face. It wasn't clean. It wasn't finished. Pruitt was still walking around outside somewhere, and Huck was still technically a sitting judge, and Calls was still in room 6 at the hotel with his fraudulent survey materials. The thing was tilted but not resolved, and Clara understood enough about how power worked to know that tilted was not the same as fallen, and that the next weeks and months were going to be full of the slow, grinding work of legal process, depositions, federal interviews, and the particular exhaustion of being on the right side of a fight, that the wrong side had more resources to sustain. But the ledger existed. Warren Cale had signed his name. Emmeline's notary stamp was on 3 pages of documented testimony. A federal marshal was in a staid courtroom taking statements. And somewhere on a canyon road with bad footing and dried apricots and a 30-year friendship in his saddlebags, Doc Hearn was riding toward Santa Fe. It was enough. Not everything, but enough. She stood up. She walked outside into the hard morning light. Devereaux followed her out. They stood on the courthouse steps, and the town went about its business around them, or tried to, though the business was slower and more diagonal than usual, everyone finding reasons to be somewhere they could watch the courthouse without appearing to watch it. "You should know," Devereaux said, "that Tanner will want you in town for the next few days. Statements, follow-up questions, it's going to be slow." "I know. And Pruitt's lawyers will file something by end of week, challenge the federal jurisdiction, probably. Try to move proceedings to a different venue." "I know that too," she said. "You're not surprised by any of this." "My father spent 7 years building a case," she said. "I didn't think winning it was going to take a morning." She looked at the street, at the feed store where 2 men were now openly watching the courthouse instead of pretending not to. He knew it was going to take time. That's why he documented everything. He wasn't building a weapon. He was building a record. Records take time to matter. Devereaux was quiet for a moment. "He knew he might not be there when it mattered," he said. "I think he did," Claire said. "I think that's why the ledger was in the desk and not in a bank box or a lawyer's office. He wanted me to find it. He knew I'd find it." She stopped. "I just wish he'd left a letter with it." "What would the letter have said?" She thought about it. The street was bright and hot, and the morning was moving on without them. "Probably something practical," she said. "Probably something about the spring's output in dry months and which of the west fence posts needed replacing." She almost smiled. He wasn't a man for long letters. He thought practical information was the kindest thing you could leave someone. He wasn't wrong, Devereaux said. No, she said. He wasn't. She looked at him then, directly. The way she'd been looking at him for days now, but with something different in it. The particular look of a person who has been in a difficult situation with someone and come out the other side and needs to take stock of who is standing there. What will you do? She asked. He looked at the road south of town, which was the road that had brought him here. Tanner will need my statement, he said. That'll take a day, maybe 2. And after? He didn't answer immediately. She watched the road answer him somehow, the way roads answered men who had been on them long enough. I don't know, he said, and he said it without the flatness that had characterized most of his uncertainties. This one had something live in it. First time in a while I haven't known. That can be a good thing, she said. Depending. Depending on what? On whether you want it to be, she said. They stood on the steps in the heat and said nothing more about it, because some things didn't need to be resolved in the same morning they were raised, and because Tanner appeared in the doorway behind them with his notebook and asked if Miss Whitmore was ready to give her statement, and she was. She went back inside. She sat across from Tanner at the small table and she told him everything. From the day her father died to the morning she found the ledger to Willis Rand's hand on her wrist, to the jar of dark liquid sitting on a shelf in her tack room, wrapped in cloth with "Do Not Open" written on it in pencil. She told him about Cale and Calls and Marsh and Huck. She told him about Emmeline's notary stamp and Doc Hearn on the Canyon Road, and Petey carrying a deputy's card to a telegraph office at 2 in the morning. Tanner wrote it all down. He was a good listener, the kind who didn't rush and didn't summarize before you'd finished, and who asked clarifying questions that showed he'd been paying attention rather than just waiting for his turn. It took 2 hours. When she came out, the street had changed. Not dramatically. This was still a town of 400 people doing what they normally did. But there was a quality to it that was different from the quality of the morning when she'd walked in. Word moved fast in small towns, always had. By now, most of Redemption Flat knew that a federal marshal had stayed Huck's proceeding, and that Garrett Pruitt had walked out of a courthouse without getting what he'd come for. And that second fact was one that this town had not witnessed before and was still absorbing. The feed store owner was standing outside his door without any obvious merchandise-related reason to be there. The woman who ran the dry goods gave Clara a nod when she passed that was slightly more substantial than the nod she'd been giving her for 28 years. Small things. The kind of small things that were large things in the context of a community that had been afraid of one man for a decade. Devereaux was at the livery with his roan. He'd checked the horse while she was giving her statement, which was exactly the kind of thing she'd come to expect from him, finding the practical task while the other things resolved themselves. Anything? She asked. Calls left the hotel this morning, he said. Tanner has a man on the road south. He won't get far. He ran his hand along the roan's neck. Rand is still in town. He'll stay until Pruitt tells him otherwise. And Pruitt? At the hotel, with a man who came up from Las Cruces this morning, which means he had a lawyer on ready standby. He glanced at her. He was prepared for this, just not as prepared as he thought. 3 days later, Doc Hearn rode back into the Rocking W with an empty saddlebag and a federal confirmation number written on a piece of paper in an archivist's careful hand. The ledger was in Santa Fe, in the Federal Records Office, logged and cataloged and assigned to the investigation that Deputy Commissioner Aldis had formally opened 2 days prior under a case number that had weight behind it. Doc dismounted slowly, with the careful deliberateness of a man who had covered a lot of Canyon Road and was having a private conversation with his hip about it. He accepted coffee from Clara and sat in her father's cottonwood chair and was quiet for a while. There's a man in Santa Fe, he said, in the Federal Records Office. Young fellow. He read the first 20 pages of your father's ledger while I waited for the log number. He paused. He said it was the most carefully documented case of systematic land fraud he'd seen come through that office. Clara sat across from him on the porch steps, the way she'd sat on the steps the morning after Rand had grabbed her wrist, which felt like a different year now, even though it had been less than a week. My father would have been embarrassed by that, she said. He would have said he was just keeping records. That's what he told me, Doc said. Once. He said keeping records was the only honest form of stubbornness. She held that for a while. The investigation took 4 months. Federal proceedings moved at their own pace, which was not the pace of the people inside them. And Clara learned in those months that being on the right side of a legal process was not the same as finding it comfortable. There were depositions and contradictory filings, and 3 separate attempts by Pruitt's legal team to challenge the jurisdiction or the evidence or the validity of the federal commission under which Tanner had operated. Each attempt was addressed and dismissed. The ledger held up because it was what it was. 7 years of careful notation in a careful man's hand, dates and names and amounts and cross-references that could be verified against county records that Pruitt's people hadn't thought to alter because they hadn't known the ledger existed. Henry Marsh resigned his position at the land registry in September, citing health reasons. Nobody believed the health reasons. He left town in October and nobody heard from him after, which was its own kind of verdict. Calls was found on the road south, as Tanner had said. His leather satchel contained blank county documents with official seals, a partially completed survey for the Northwest Whitmore parcel that placed the spring on Pruitt's side of the property line by 8 feet, and a second survey, already filed, that had done the same thing to the Lena property 4 years earlier and had never been challenged because the Lena family hadn't had anyone to challenge it to. Huck cooperated when he understood the alternative exactly as Devereaux had predicted. He gave a full account of Pruitt's instructions to him over 6 years in exchange for a reduced charge, and the account was exhaustive in the way that accounts from men who have been afraid for a long time tend to be exhaustive once they finally open. He resigned in November. The territorial government appointed an interim judge who had no connection to Haskell County. Garrett Pruitt was indicted in October on 11 counts. The trial was held in Santa Fe the following spring. Clara went. She sat in the gallery for 2 days and listened to the evidence laid out. Her father's ledger as the spine of it, Cale's account, the Halbert family's testimony, the Lena family's testimony, Calls's cooperation agreement, Huck's account, and the jar of dark liquid from the tack room, which a federal chemist had identified as a compound that when introduced to a water source would render it brackish and undrinkable within 72 hours. On the 3rd day, she went back to the ranch because there was work to do and because she had given everything she had to give to the proceeding and needed to be on her own land for a while. She heard the verdict by telegraph, guilty on 9 of 11 counts. Pruitt's sentence was 12 years in a federal penitentiary. His land holdings in Haskell County were placed in federal receivership pending review of the acquisition circumstances, and 3 properties were ultimately returned to their original owners or their heirs, including a partial restoration to the Halbert family. It was not complete justice. Complete justice would have required things that legal systems couldn't provide: the years of fear, the farm that had burned, the family that had left without saying goodbye, the man named Ortega who had disappeared one winter and was never spoken of again. Those things existed outside the reach of indictments and verdicts, but it was what it was. It was real. It had happened. Devereaux stayed through October. He'd stayed past his statement, past the initial federal proceedings, past the point where his presence was legally necessary. He'd stayed because there was work to do on the ranch and because he was good at work, and because the Rocking W's fences had 6 months of deferred maintenance built up and Domingo's knees were not what they had been. He didn't say he was staying, he just didn't leave. There was a difference that Clara understood without discussion. In the evenings, sometimes they sat on the porch after supper and talked or didn't talk, and it was the kind of not talking that was itself a form of company, which was rarer than people understood. She told him about her father, not the ledger and the evidence, but the other things. The post hole he'd been digging when he found the spring, the broken ribs from showing off on the south wall, the Friday night card games, and the pride he took in a properly set fence post. He told her things too, in the slow way he told everything, and she understood that what he told her was not the whole story and that the whole story would take longer than October to get to, and she was not in a hurry. He left on a Tuesday in late October, which was almost the same time of year he'd arrived, though the heat was different, dry and cooling now instead of dry and punishing. He saddled the roan in the barn while she stood in the doorway, and he did it with the methodical care of a man who had saddled a horse 1,000 times and respected the repetition. "You know where Santa Fe is," she said. "I do," he said. Aldous mentioned he might have work. Something about restructuring the investigation unit. Devereaux tightened the cinch. "Well, He mentioned it to me, too. Are you considering it? I'm considering several things, he said. He turned from the horse and looked at her. In the barn light, he looked less like a man the road had half digested and more like a man who had remembered something about himself that the road had made him forget. I'm considering whether a man who left a thing badly can come back to it differently. Can he? Depends on whether he's actually different, he said, or just tired of being the same. She held his gaze. Which is it for you? He thought about it, really thought about it, the way he thought about things. Not performing the consideration, just doing it. I think, he said, that I spent 3 years running away from something and landed here running into it, and the two things don't feel the same. No, she said. They don't. He mounted. The roan shifted under him and settled, and he sat it well, the easy way he sat everything, and he looked down at her from that height with the expression she'd been watching for weeks now. The one that wasn't carefully controlled, the one that was just his actual face. All right, he said, when I know what I'm doing. I'll be here, she said, when you know. He rode out through the gate and south on the main road, and she watched him until the road took him, and then she watched the empty road for a while, which was something she'd done a fair amount of in her life and had gotten reasonably good at. The spring did not care about any of this. It kept doing what it had always done, pushing cold water up through the fissure in the limestone, filling the basin her father had built with concrete and intention, running down the channel to the main trough, sustaining the life of the rocking W through the dry months and the wet months with equal patience. It had been doing this before Thomas Whitmore found it, and it would be doing it long after all of them were gone, which was either consoling or humbling, depending on the kind of morning you were having. Clara kept the ranch. She kept it the way her father had kept it, through the daily argument with the land and the heat and the work that never finished. She fixed the 6 months of deferred fence maintenance. She hired 2 hands in the spring, one of whom was a former Halbert farm worker who needed the job and had earned a reference from a family who didn't forget who'd sat in a courthouse gallery for them. She kept Domingo, who was not going anywhere, and Petey, who turned 15 and then 16 and grew 6 inches, and was becoming the kind of young man who apologized for things he should have thought about before doing, and then actually learned from the apology, which was rarer than it ought to be. She wrote to Doc Hearn every few weeks. He wrote back in a cramped script that was getting harder to read as his eyesight shifted with age. But the content was clear, and the warmth in it was the warmth of a man who was finishing well and knew it. A letter came from Santa Fe in November. It was short, the way letters from Devereaux were short, practical in the way he was practical. He had taken Aldis's offer. He was rebuilding something he'd left in poor condition, which he said was the right kind of difficult. He said the canyon country south of the Ortega Wash was beautiful in fall if she'd never seen it from the road that went through. She had seen it, but not from that road. She wrote back. What she had learned in the months since a tired drifter on a red roan horse had said 3 words across a sunlit yard and changed the direction of everything was something she didn't have a clean way to state and didn't try to state cleanly. It was something about patience, not the passive kind that waits for things to improve, but the active kind that builds towards something even when the building is invisible. Her father had built for 7 years and hadn't lived to see the foundation hold. She was living in what he'd built, and the walls were solid, and she understood now that this was the point. The building mattered more than the builders being there to watch it stand. She understood something else too, something about the people who had shown up. Doc Hearn with his bad hip and his federal commission, Emmeline Voss with her leather satchel and her notary stamp, and her 23 students who were learning, among other things, that their teacher was a woman who stood in front of things that needed standing in front of. Warren Cale, who had been afraid for 3 years, and sat down one night in a schoolroom and wrote his name at the bottom of a page anyway. Petey, who wrote in the dark with an expired deputy's card and knocked on a telegraph operator's door because someone had told him it mattered. And Domingo, who never explained anything and did everything, who stood at gateposts in the dark watching roads and brought dried apricots and knew exactly where to put a ledger in a barn so that nobody who was looking for it would find it. None of them were heroes in the way that word usually got used. They were ordinary people who had reached a point where ordinary was no longer sufficient, and they had each chosen, in their own way and for their own reasons, to be something more than their fear. That was the thing about the spring. Powerful men had looked at it and seen a resource, something to take and control and profit from. What they couldn't see, because their particular kind of vision didn't accommodate it, was that a water source sustained what grew around it. The cattle, the land, the people, the community that the land supported, the relationships between those people, the trust, built slowly, that made collective action possible. All of that was downstream of the spring. All of that was what they'd actually been trying to take. They hadn't taken it. On the day the verdict came through by telegraph, Clara walked out to the northwest corner of the rocking W and stood at the limestone basin and put her hand in the cold water the way she had the night 2 men had tried to poison it. She held her hand there until the cold moved up her arm and she felt the upwelling from below, steady and indifferent and permanent. Her father had stood in this spot when he was 26 years old, following the wet ground under the rock, and had made the best decision of his life. He hadn't known then what it would cost. He hadn't known then what it would be worth. He'd just followed where the water led and trusted that a thing which sustained life was worth building around. She pulled her hand out and dried it on her coat. His coat, which she was still wearing, which she would probably keep wearing for reasons that had nothing to do with warmth and everything to do with the particular stubbornness of loving someone who wasn't there to receive it anymore. The spring filled the basin. The basin fed the channel. The channel ran to the trough. The rocking W went on.